In the name of the one who blesses us and claims us as his beloved. Please be seated. Good morning.
Good morning.
I have to start by saying that I've looked forward to preaching for all of you since I moved to Minneapolis in mid-October from my home state of Ohio. I came to the city seeking a place of rest and healing after 4 very difficult years, 2 of which were the pandemic. And so, truth be told, I have not been in a pulpit since last August. A few weeks after I arrived here at St. Mark's, and after I fell in love with the community, I decided to make this cathedral my spiritual home. And so I met with Dean Paul, and we walked down to Dunn Brothers Coffee, and of course I offered to help out in various ministries, preaching, and some other priestly duties. I love preaching, and I don't want to get rusty, I told him. And so the dean was gracious enough to extend an invitation to me. However, shortly after that invitation was offered, it dawned on me. I had to preach in this big pulpit. It's kind of intimidating. I've also never preached in a cathedral before. It's the first time. And so, weeks before, I was starting to get a little bit nervous. Am I still qualified? Also, there's some great preachers here. Am I good enough? And so, as today approached, I decided it might be a good idea to come down to St. Mark's this week, test out the acoustics, learn all about the sound system, and Reverend Siri suggested, get used to standing up here. And so she invited me to the cathedral for some tea and conversation, and we met here in the nave to chat for a while. I want you to feel comfortable, she said. Why don't you climb up there and check it out? So I did. I climbed up here expecting a tutorial on microphones, but I was somewhat surprised when she did not offer me instructions. Instead, she stood down there, looked up at me, and simply said, "You belong here." This caught me off guard. And I'm sure Siri meant the pulpit, but the fact that I haven't been in a pulpit for so long, I took it as, "You belong here," as in St. Mark's, which I totally agree. However, to give credit where credit is due, Siri gave me my sermon idea. She captured the core of today's gospel message. You belong here. Jesus gathered his first disciples. He traveled throughout the countryside, healing and proclaiming that the kingdom of God was at hand. But he begins his public teaching ministry with some pretty confusing statements. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. A total of 8 blessings in all. So I imagine those first disciples and the followers heard that and said, "This makes absolutely no sense. What kind of kingdom is that? Kingdoms are supposed to be strong, powerful." When I was young, in one of my Sunday school classrooms, we had a poster of the Beatitudes. This was one of those old school Sunday school posters with like the really flowery images, some disembodied prayer hands, the sheep with the glassy eyes, and shepherds that looked way too sedate. And then next to that poster of the Beatitudes, there was a similarly decorated list of the 10 Commandments. When I was a little kid, I used to look up at these posters and think, those are the requirements for getting into heaven. And so I felt pretty good about the 10 Commandments. I was a pretty well-behaved kid, except from the occasional dishonoring my mother and father by back-talking or bearing false witness against my brothers to get out of getting in trouble. Those commandments on adultery, which I didn't even know what that was, and murder, I viewed those as freebies. This poster on the Beatitudes, however, that was a little bit more challenging. Peacemaker? When would I have the opportunity to be a peacemaker? Persecuted? People in my small town did not persecute children going to Sunday school. But you know what? Nobody congratulates you for being persecuted. You probably would not be excited to be considered poor in the spirit either. And nobody wants to be in the midst of a situation that would require them to be a peacemaker. In fact, we try to avoid all of these things. That avoidance is the problem. You see, we try to avoid difficulties by attaching ourselves to things that offer false security to us, things that offer empty promises of happiness. And so we accumulate material wealth, we place ourselves in positions of power. Some might turn to alcohol or drugs to avoid painful feelings. Others become addicted to other things, money, prestige, working too hard, having to be the absolute best. In this accumulating and in this clinging, we alienate ourselves. We become trapped behind this stuff. And in doing so, we recognize that we belong only to the center of our own universe. And so while doing all these self-isolating behaviors and making all that accumulation, we constantly continue to ask ourselves, am I good enough? Do I qualify? Am I safe? But here's the problem. As we keep asking those questions, we keep clinging to more and more to gain a sense of security. It becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. And so the Beatitudes, they offer us an alternative to this desperate clinging. But first, there's a caveat, the most difficult step. We have to recognize that we're clinging, which is difficult to do. This is the most difficult step because it requires us to look beyond ourselves, to look towards God and accept that this is not working. I am not my own God. Powerlessness. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the powerless, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Richard Rohr, my favorite Christian author and mystic, describes this first beatitude, the poor in spirit, as meaning an inner emptiness, humility, a beginner's mind, and to live without the need for personal righteousness or reputation. He goes on to say that this is the powerlessness that the 12 steps discuss in the first step. It's also interesting to note here that Matthew uses a particular word for the word poor. I'm going to screw the Greek up here. Tochi. Tochi literally means the very empty ones, those who crouch. They are the bent-over beggars in Jesus' time, the little nobodies of this world who have absolutely nothing. These are the people who aren't self-preoccupied, who aren't full of themselves in any way. Jesus said, "Happy are they, because they are the freest." Nothing gets in between them and God. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven, not in some far-off future after their death, but in the absolute immediate, the here and the now, having nothing but possessing everything. And this is because they are fully reliant, fully dependent on God, fully dependent on the goodness of others to get them through each day. And in realizing this, their material world and their spiritual world become one and the same. The poor in spirit are able to fully give themselves over to grace because they have nothing else to lose. But the inverse of this is also true. For those with high prestige, with a lot of security, perhaps with a lot of money or power, people who really spend a lot of time building up that sense of security, letting go and accepting powerlessness becomes so much more difficult. And this is why Jesus once told his followers that it was easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a wealthy man to discover the kingdom of heaven. And so very few of us will find ourselves in one of these two categories entirely, possessing nothing or possessing seemingly everything. We're somewhere in the middle. But whether we are poor in material possessions, or whether we are poor in the sense that our material goods impoverish us spiritually and alienate us from what is holy, the Beatitudes remind us that we are both victims of a world that is bent on alienation rather than belonging, a world that is bent on separating people rather than bringing together. Am I qualified? Am I good enough? Yes. And so this is where the church could be a beacon of hope. This past week, I had the pleasure of attending St. Mark's first roundtable discussion. And coincidentally, totally unplanned for today, the topic was belonging. And so a question was posed to each table. When did you first realize that you belonged at St. Mark's? And so today, since it's our annual meeting Sunday, I'll ask you the same question. When did you first realize you belonged here? Or perhaps if you're new here, what did you come here seeking? As I listened to the stories that came, what I found fascinating about each person's story is that their sense of belonging here at the cathedral came from somebody else enacting grace through the Beatitudes, because the Beatitudes reflect God's grace. For example, several people I talked to, both at my table and in the larger conversation at the cathedral, found their way to the cathedral because of its welcome to LGBTQ people. They desired a place in a community where they could be loved for who they were authentically created to be. They longed for acceptance. So blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. A member also shared with the others at our table that she came here seeking comfort after losing a loved one. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Another felt belonging, caring for neighbors in need of food. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Another came here seeking a place of rest, and they found it in this community also. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And so when it came time for me to share, I shared my own story, and I'll share it with all of you. I arrived in Minneapolis in search of a place for rest, for discernment, and healing. One Wednesday in late October, I decided that I was going to slip in for the Wednesday noon service. Now, Typically, noon services on Wednesdays are attended by a small number of people, maybe 3 or 4. I came in and there was about 20 people sitting up here listening to the dean that day. I tried to sneak in covertly so nobody would notice me and then slip out. Well, that did not work. I started engaging in conversation. I felt welcomed. And most of all, I felt welcomed when not a single person in that group balked when I told them that I moved here for recovery. I found belonging, and have since found belonging in a community that continues to be a place of healing and blessing for me since I moved here. And perhaps this is the biggest power of the Beatitudes, the greatest power that the Beatitudes have to give us. The Beatitudes serve to form us into a body that is much bigger than our individual bodies. They do this because they're an invitation to step away from self-separation, from isolation. They also urge us to use our power to elevate the powerless. And so I think back to those posters that hung in my Sunday school classroom with the disembodied prayer hands and the glassy-eyed sheep. This isn't about some heaven light years away. It's not in the great hereafter. It's about heaven being accessible here and right now. Blessed are you. This is an invitation. You belong. Amen.